We often hear a lot about the fathers of the digital revolution, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg. But we don't often hear of the critical and forgotten role that women played in the evolution of computer technology. Author Walter Isaacson writes about them all in his new book. It's called The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. And he joins us now for more. It's good to have you up here in Toronto.
Well, thank you. It's good to be at this table.
What number of trip is this to Toronto for you? Because I know you get here from time to time.
Many times, and then Ottawa as well, because I used to be at Time Magazine, and I used to spend a lot of time up here.
Indeed. Okay, I'd like to know, first of all, of the many people you profile in this book who have invented the, as George Bush called it, the interwebs that we all enjoy today. What's the one thing they all share in common, the common ingredient?
Well, I think, first of all, they're rebellious. They think different, as Steve Jobs would say. You know, he had this wonderful ad about the here's to the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs, and the square holes. Everybody in this book surprised me, just how colorful they are, how quirky they are, but how that leads them to be innovative. I think you can't be that innovative unless you're willing to question the received wisdom.
So a 9-to-5 guy is not likely to be somebody at the cutting edge of innovation.
They'd be like me. I'm going to have to write about ingenious people instead of be one myself.
You chose 4 people, I suspect 3 of whom are very well known on the cover, and one not so much. Hold off on her for a second. But these 4, I should put that up there and let everybody see it. There we go. Those are the 4. Why single them out for special treatment on the cover?
Well, those are the ones who had major leaps or advances. Obviously, at the bottom, you have Alan Turing. People will be seeing a movie about him in a couple of weeks, The Imitation Game, because he comes up with the concept of a universal computer that can do any logical sequence. And he also comes up with the notion that somehow computers might be able to think without us, something that doesn't prove to be exactly true. And then, of course, there's Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, very recognizable, but I wanted to show that what made them kind of imaginative. Why were they able to take these passionate leaps they did, and how do they form great teams around them, which is another theme of the book.
Let me ask you then to focus on the 4th one, who I suspect is the one we know the least about. Ada Lovelace. Who was she?
Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter, and so
Byron the poet.
Byron the poet, and so she developed a poetical streak, but her mother, as you might suspect, wasn't particularly fond of Lord Byron when Ada was growing up. He had too much of a romantic streak for Lady Byron's taste. And so had her daughter, Ada, tutored mainly in mathematics, as if that were going to be an antidote to being too romantic or something. Not true. She becomes somebody who loves poetry and math, somebody who loves the arts and loves the sciences, just like Steve Jobs or all the great innovators. They have a foot in both camps. She calls it poetical science. So, for example, she looks at the punch cards that are showing the mechanical looms in England in the 1830s, how to weave patterns. And she says, you know, these punch cards with my friend Charles Babbage, who was making a numerical calculator, her friend was, said, with these punch cards, we can have the calculator do anything. It won't just be numbers. It can do music, it can do words, it can do art, it can do anything that can be noted in symbols. And so she was the first person to see a general purpose computer, what we call a computer. And she even wrote a step-by-step series of instructions to teach it how to do things, i.e. she's the first person to publish a computer programmer, and that's why we call her the first computer programmer.
And yeah, I mean, there have been some people who've disputed that, obviously, over the course of years. Do you think those are people who simply weren't prepared to give a woman her due, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think that, you know, sometimes she gets given an outsized reputation, but you know, when people criticize her and say, well, she wasn't quite as good in math as, you know, she claimed to be, I say, okay, she did a computer program to generate Bernoulli numbers. Yeah, it took me about 4 days working on what are Bernoulli numbers, how would you do the sequence, and I say, if you don't think she's so smart, tell me what the 7th, 8th, and 9th Bernoulli numbers are and how you would generate them. And that usually shuts people up.
How did her contemporaries view her?
Well, you know, she was published in a scientific journal with her own initials on the paper, which is unusual for a woman. And she was a very aristocratic woman. She was the Countess of Lovelace. So she was pretty well respected. She had a very close friend, Mary Somerville, who was also a woman scientist and mathematician. And those are the 2 pioneers in the 1800s of women who say, yes, we can be published in math. And in some ways it's a shame because women have been written out of the history of math and computing.
Let me show the cover of the book again to make this point. You tell me if there's anything to this. Killed himself?
Yeah.
Dead at 36 from cancer?
Mm-hmm.
There is there's a tragic element
They're
that runs through it.
tragic heroes. Obviously, Alan Turing is even more tragic because he's gay and he's working for British intelligence, breaking the German codes during the war. And he's not ashamed of being gay, but he ends up getting arrested for it because back then, it was hard to be gay, especially if you were in intelligence. And so he undergoes hormone treatment. They sentence him to that.
Estrogen
treatment, in order, as if he were a machine. And this is what his whole life is about, the difference between people and machines. So it's as if he's a machine, he's going to be reprogrammed not to be homosexual. So he goes through it all and sort of takes it in stride. But finally, one day, he dips an apple into some cyanide, takes a bite out of it, and commits suicide. And it's tragic, but it's also, to me in this book, a little bit of a understanding that his notion of the imitation games, that machines and humans couldn't be told apart. I don't think a machine would have dipped an apple in cyanide and committed suicide. It does show that we're talking about very human people here, and it's really interesting.
And she is dead by 36 of uterine cancer.
Yes, and she actually spent a lot of time on opium. Everybody in this book, as I said, is a little bit rebellious, a little bit of a misfit. I think it takes that to be a great innovator.
Let's talk about another. I'm not sure this next woman I want to talk about is a great misfit, considering she was in the military till she was about 80 years old. But tell us about Grace Hopper.
Well, she was a rebel. Grace Hopper gets her PhD in math from Yale in the 1930s, back when a lot of women were getting PhDs in math. She's leading a pretty mundane life. She's a math professor at a college. Then Pearl Harbor happens. So she becomes a rebel. She leaves her husband, she gives up her job teaching math, and she joins the Navy. And she thinks she wants a more exciting life. Now the Navy, instead of assigning her to run a battleship or something, assigns her to be the programmer on this computer being built at Harvard that was for military purposes. And so she becomes the original programmer of the Mark I IBM computer at Harvard, just like there's 6 women programming ENIAC, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. So you have all these women who are pioneers. They're Ada Lovelace's heirs. They're pioneers.
That's ENIAC now that we're looking at, this picture right here.
Right. In fact, that's Francis Bialik and Gene Jennings. And you see the way they have to program ENIAC is you have to unplug the cables and plug them in. At one point, the guy who was running ENIAC said, "What do you know about electricity?" And Gene Jennings said, "Well, I know, she went through Ohm's law." And I said, "No, I just want to know if you're afraid of it because you have to unplug things." And she said, "Look, I'm a mathematician, a physicist. I'm not afraid of electricity."
So, but very fair to say that women had a perhaps previously not particularly well-known role in the creation of the world's first computers.
Well, especially in programming. I think boys with their toys thought the hardware was the important thing, that how you built the actual machine was most important. And in some ways, at least the women who did ENIAC kind of later said that the men thought that the notion of how you'd program it and reprogram it was a little bit more clerical work. Now, of course, by the end of the war, doing missile trajectories, they didn't need to do that anymore. They had to do atom bomb tests and weather. So it had to be reprogrammed all the time. And these women, including Grace Hopper when she started working with the women of ENIAC, they create programming languages like COBOL, and they do it collaboratively.
COBOL standing for?
It's a business-oriented language. I don't know what the CO is, but and what it means is you can do programs for different pieces of hardware, whether it's a Sperry Rand or a Honeywell or an IBM. It's like, a Windows operating system. It can work on many pieces of hardware. So that notion of creating software, it was sort of the pioneers were the women.
They tried to put Grace Hopper out to, putting her out to pasture is a bit strong, but they wanted her to retire when she reached a certain age from the service. And she did for a year. But then they apparently couldn't live without her, and they brought her back.
They brought her back because they had to redo some of the programming languages, but also she became a symbol. I mean, by the end, she's in her 80s when she's the oldest admiral in the Navy, And she's not only getting a medal from Ronald Reagan, she's appearing on the David Letterman show. And this is great because up until those couple of TV appearances, people didn't realize. My daughter turned me on to Ada Lovelace. She turned me on to Ada Hopper when she was in high school. She said, "Dad, I didn't know that women were programmers, that women could be in computer science. In fact, the only woman programmer I'd ever heard of was in a Batman comic." And then I saw this woman, Grace Hopper, and then I read about Ada Lovelace, and it's a shame they've been minimized in history because more girls would go into computers if we knew we had role models.
Well, having said that, Grace Hopper did get something awfully big named after her, which was not bad.
Yeah, well, so did Ada Lovelace. They all are pretty well known. Ada, the Defense Department programming language, is named Ada. And, I'm going up to Harvard in 2 weeks, and beginning of December, because that's where the Mark I is still there in the lobby of the Science Center. If you ever go, the huge machine, and it used to have all these pictures and panels, but no picture of any woman. It was just the men who had built it. And I mentioned that one day, and of course, they got kind of exercised, and they immediately changed the display. And now on her birthday in December, we're going to have Grace Hopper Day celebrated at Harvard.
Nice. And I'm trying to remember now what they named after her. Was it a battleship or an aircraft carrier or something?
Yeah, there was a ship named after her. The women of ENIAC are the ones who truly haven't gotten their due. Somebody should make a movie about them. There was Frances Bilac and Jean Jennings. And I think, I saw a picture when we were walking into your studio of Jean Jennings. But she was somebody who, grown up, like the sixth or seventh children in a poor farm family in Missouri. And she went off, there she is. Just gorgeous. And she wrote a wonderful book called Pioneer Programmer that, was published by a university press. But, they were not very well known because they did it during wartime secrecy. But they went off to Aberdeen Proving Ground to be secretly trained on how to do programming. And then when John von Neumann arrives from Los Alamos and has to do a new type of atom bomb. They've done the atom bomb, and the question is, a hydrogen bomb, would it work? He has to have a computer do it, and it's the women programmers of ENIAC who help figure out how to do it. So I hope they get their moment in the sun, too.
Why do you think it's taken so long for that part of history to be told?
I don't really know, because they're certainly interesting, especially Jean Jennings. I mean, they were all unmarried back in the day when they were doing it, and they were right about having Tom Collinses, which is this sort of, I think, gin drink. Gin and somebody will write in and tell us how to make a Tom Collins. With all their boys they met at Aberdeen Proving Ground, but they get to be really serious mathematicians. And I don't know why we don't celebrate them more, but frankly, most people don't know the men who created the computer. Most of your viewers would not have heard of John Mauchly or Presper Eckert or
no, but they know
John Adanasoff.
Steve Wozniak, and they know Bill Gates. And
right.
These names
and they
are
know
well
Alan
known.
Turing.
Steve Jobs, of course.
Yeah.
These names are well known.
I don't quite know why, but I hope the Innovators, this book, gives enough shout-outs and, in fact, chapters to the women of ENIAC.
Later in this program, we're going to assemble 4 women who are young women who are part of the tech sector today, and they're going to talk to us about the sexism, among other things, but the sexism in the tech sector. It is overwhelmingly a male-dominated thing. And the fact that these women haven't had their story well told, perhaps until now, kind of buttresses the point that they're trying to make. What do you think the consequences are for the tech sector, given how you've written the history about it, if it chooses to somehow turn its back on half the population?
This is a revolution, the digital revolution. It's like the American Revolution. We have our heroes of the American Revolution or of the Industrial Revolution. This is but if you have a revolution in which you exclude half the people, it's not going to be a sustainable revolution. What's really weird is about in 1984, I think 38% of people getting computer science degrees in America were women. That's now been cut in half. We're going the wrong way. Only 17% of people getting computer science degrees in the US are women. One problem is they don't have the right role models. I think they now are starting to get them, and I hope this book gives more role models. But also, and I'm sure the women who are going to be on your show will tell you, there's not a friendly, open atmosphere amongst some of the hackathon, gameathon type people in the tech world, but that's got to change. And especially now with people like Sheryl Sandberg, Megan Smith, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States, so many, Marissa Mayer, so many great women and women engineers, I think it's changing.
Although the title of your book, in part, uses a word which may explain some of it, there are a lot of geeks in this field. And geeks don't necessarily, can I say this out loud here? Geeks don't necessarily know how to relate to women very well when they're in their basement coding, for 20 hours a day.
That's why we need girl geeks. The girl geeks will inherit the world.
The girl geeks will inherit the world. Okay, that's good. Do you think today the digital world presents enough safe space for women to succeed in?
Yes, I do think, especially now, things are moving in the right direction because every company, Google has 85% of its engineers are men, but Google knows that it really needs to open up. So another thing I think you can count on is that girls who code get jobs. If you enter the tech space, especially if you're a woman engineer, I think you're in high demand because I think companies want to change and want to open up this revolution to women. And by the way, also to people of color, to people who are born in poor backgrounds. To me, another worry is you don't want to have a revolution where people who didn't grow up with Wi-Fi in their homes or didn't grow up with their own laptops, they get excluded. We have to make sure there's not a digital divide, that all people get to play in this revolution.
In which case, how significant did you think it was when, was it Google and Apple both announced that they were going to allow their employees or offer to their female employees the right to freeze their eggs in case they wanted to postpone pregnancy so that they could
That's a
do their
complicated issue, and I'm probably not the best expert to opine on it.
Okay, but safe to say that the kids coming up today in school who could take examples from this book, who are women, they don't have to be so afraid of this sector anymore. Is that a conclusion you'd like people to come to?
Absolutely. In fact, women programmers, I think, are in high demand, but also it is a sector that is trying to be more creative. For a while, the innovation space was driven mainly by engineers. But this phase of the revolution we're entering now is mainly by creative people. People in journalism, arts, fashion, role-playing games, LARPs, theater, you name it, who are connecting both in social networks and creative enterprises into technology. So you need a broader base of people like Ada Lovelace, or for that matter, Steve Jobs, who could stand at the intersection of the creative industries and the technological engineering industries.
In my last 10 seconds here, I am tempted to ask the former chairman of CNN, what channel will you be watching the election returns on tomorrow night?
I will be. I love CNN, and I still think when big news happens, I go there. If I were here, and I'd be watching here or you, but I think I'm going to be back in the U.S. by then.
Just checking. So
okay.
it will be CNN.
Oh yeah. No, I'm a Wolf Blitzer fan, Anderson Cooper fan, all of them.
Okay, good enough. Walter Isaacson, we congratulate you for the good reviews you're getting on The Innovators, how a group of hackers, geniuses, and geeks created the digital revolution, and we thank you for making time for us at TVO tonight.
Hey, this was great. It was good to be with you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.